There was once a man named Elias who had never seen the sunrise, nor the face of his own mother. Blind from birth, he had grown up in a world where sound replaced color and touch became his vision. Every corner of his modest home was memorized through his fingertips, and every person he knew was stored in the rhythm of their voice. Yet despite his darkness, Elias never let the world think of him as helpless. He moved with quiet dignity, his white cane tapping along cracked sidewalks, tracing his path through a small, weathered town that had grown old with him. Elias lived alone in a little cottage at the edge of town. Surrounded by wildflowers he could only smell but never see. He earned a humble living by tuning pianos. His sense of hearing so refined, he could detect when a single string was even slightly off. The townspeople admired him, not only for his skill, but for his quiet warmth. He rarely spoke of the weight he carried, of the aching void that followed him like a shadow. There was always a deeper silence behind his words, one that no conversation could fill. As a boy, Elias used to ask his parents to describe the world. "What does the sky look like?" he would ask his father, or "How bright is red?" His mother tried her best to answer, but her voice always trailed off with sorrow. Eventually, he stopped asking. The world seemed too vast, too unreachable. The years passed, and so did his parents, leaving Elias with only memories shaped by scent and sound. He stopped wondering about colors, about faces, about what it meant to see. That door was closed, and he dared not knock anymore. But in the quiet hours of night, as he lay in bed listening to the softening of the wind against the shutters, he still dreamed. His dreams were strange things, abstract yet deeply vivid. Though he had no image to recall, they were filled with movement and warmth. He felt waves, not of water, but of something unseen and holy washing over his soul. He would wake from these dreams with tears on his cheeks, clutching his chest as if something divine had passed through him. Despite the sorrow buried deep in him, Elias lived with a steady routine. He rose before dawn, prepared his modest breakfast, bread, eggs, and tea, and set out for work if there were any clients. When there weren't, he would sit by the window and listen to the wind or the birds, wondering what they looked like. He never allowed bitterness to take root. But there was a loneliness that never left, a quiet ache that settled into his bones like the chill of winter that never fully melted. He had no family left, no wife or children. Love had once come close to him, in the form of a young woman named Clara. She had seen past his blindness, found beauty in his soul, but life had other plans. Her family moved far away, and Elias, unwilling to burden her with a future in darkness, had let her go without a fight. He often thought of her and wondered if she ever remembered the man who could only offer her half a world. Years turned into decades, and Elias aged with quiet acceptance. Yet something inside him had begun to stir. He didn't know what it was or why it had begun, but it felt as though something was shifting, like a melody in the wind, too faint to hear but too persistent to ignore. His soul, long accustomed to the silence, now trembled with something new, a longing he could neither name nor escape. It felt like a calling, but to where, or to whom, he could not say. Elias had grown used to the hush of the church, to the hollow echoes of his own footsteps and the faint creaks of aging were beneath his feet. Most days he sat motionless on the front pew, listening to the breeze as it passed through the broken stained glass windows. He often imagined what the colors once looked like, perhaps reds like fire, blues like ocean depths, and greens like the vineyards he remembered from his childhood. Yet these colors were now only textures in his memory, like dreams fading before dawn. His world had no light, but he learned to feel presence, to sense space, to remember silence. And in that silence, the piano remained untouched, his old friend broken, dusty, voiceless. Like him, until one day, he heard footsteps, young, hesitant, not the kind that belonged to old monks or visitors lighting candles. These were softer, uncertain, like someone unsure they were allowed to be there. Elias tilted his head toward the sound. The door creaked, then closed gently. "Hello?" came a voice, unsure and boyish. Elias stood slowly. "You're not one of the caretakers," he said softly, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who no longer rushed anything. "No, sir. My name is Leo. I saw the doors open and thought it was okay to look around." Elias smiled faintly. You're welcome here. We don't get many curious souls anymore." There was a long pause before he added, "Do you like music?" Leo stepped closer, footsteps echoing slightly now. "Yes, I play guitar a little. My mom used to be a pianist. She passed a few years ago." "I used to play that piano," Elias said, turning his head toward the decaying instrument. "But it's broken now. Like me." Leo took a few more steps, examining the old piano. Its keys were chipped, the strings inside loose and rusting. He lifted the top carefully, exposing the inner workings. "It's not beyond repair," he said quietly. "Just forgotten." Elias chuckled, the sound low and genuine. "Many things are." Then came a moment, a fragile pause, where something unseen passed between them. Not quite a conversation, not yet a friendship, just an understanding. Leo looked back at Elias, who despite his blindness seemed to be looking directly at him. "If you like," Leo offered, "I could try to fix it. I used to help my grandfather repair old instruments. I know a bit." Elias turned his face toward the sound of Leo's voice and nodded. "You can be my eyes and I'll be your ears." So it began. Day by day, Leo returned. He brought tools, brushes, and oil. Elias guided him not by sight, but through memory. He remembered the exact pitch of middle C, the subtle tension of each string, the rhythm of a perfect hammer strike. With Elias's musical precision and Leo's youthful hands, the piano slowly began to breathe again. Their routine became sacred. Elias would sit beside the piano, recounting stories from his days of music. How the church used to fill with song, how children would dance in the aisles, how weddings echoed through the rafters. Leo listened and learned, not just about music, but about the resilience of man who had lost everything and still showed up every day. One afternoon, as Leo adjusted one of the stubborn hammers inside the piano, Elias said something that made Leo freeze. "I dreamed again last night." Leo glanced up, wiping sweat from his brow. "A dream? What did you see?" Elias didn't answer immediately. His face grew still, almost reverent. "Light," he whispered. "Not like sunlight or candles. It was alive. It knew me. It didn't need eyes to see me." Leo said nothing. The air around them changed. The old church seemed to lean in, as if waiting for the rest of the story. It was warm, not burning, but like home. I couldn't hear music, but I felt harmony. And in the center, I sensed someone watching me, not judging, just waiting. Leo's voice was quieter now. "Who was it?" "I don't know yet," Elias said, "but I think he's been waiting a long time." Leo swallowed hard, unsure why he suddenly felt like crying. The piano restoration didn't feel like just a project anymore. Something deeper was unfolding, something sacred. And in the days that followed, as more pieces of the piano were restored, Elias's dreams returned, brighter, clearer, and each time with that same light, that same presence. Elias never claimed to understand it fully, but something was awakening, and he was listening. The church grew warmer with each passing day, not from any fire or sunbeam, but from the rhythm of human presence returning to its corners. The old stone walls, once hollow and echoing only Elias's footsteps, now held the gentle sounds of two souls working in harmony. The slow scratch of a file against wood, the tinkering of inner piano mechanisms, the occasional quiet laugh. It had been years since the air inside felt anything like life, yet it did now, all because Elias had offered his silence, and Leo had stepped into it. Leo was coming more frequently, sometimes even before the morning light filtered through the clouded windows. He had started bringing food, bread, cheese, warm soup in a thermos, and would insist Elias eat before they worked. Elias protested at first, but Leo always managed to coax a smile from the older man. They would sit on opposite pews and talk about music, about Leo's mother, about nothing and everything. "Do you ever wish you could see again?" Leo had asked one morning, not out of pity, but genuine curiosity. Elias paused, the spoon halfway to his mouth. "There was a time I would have done anything to have it back. I used to pray for it, beg even." "What changed?" Elias set the spoon down gently. "At some point, You stop asking for the same thing over and over. Not because you give up, but because you start to realize maybe the answer was no for a reason. Leo absorbed this in silence. He often did that. Let words sit and breathe in the air instead of rushing to fill the gaps. Later that day, as Leo tightened the final screws in the piano's housing, Elias placed a hand on the polished wood and exhaled as though touching something sacred. "She's ready," he whispered. Leo nodded. "Then let's hear her." Elias sat at the bench and rested his fingers gently on the keys. The muscle memory in his hands had never left. Even in blindness, the piano had always lived somewhere deep inside him. He played a single note, clear, then another, then a chord, and then a melody. The church awakened. The sound echoed off the stone walls, traveled to the rafters, stirred the dust in the air like ash from a sacred fire. It wasn't flawless. A few keys still stuck, some tones were faint, but it was music, and it was beautiful. Leo sat in the pew and listened wide-eyed. Elias played with closed eyes, not because he had no choice, but because the music itself was enough. It was always enough. When the last note faded, Elias sat motionless. A tear rolled down his cheek. "I can't see," he whispered, "but in this moment, I feel as if I just saw something more than sight could ever give." Leo didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat was tight and his eyes burned. That night, Elias dreamed again. This time, it wasn't only light, it was form. There was a field of gold, soft grass beneath his feet, though he could not see his feet. Trees shimmered in the distance, their leaves glowing from within. The sky pulsed like a heartbeat. He could not move his limbs, but he floated, and at the center of it all, there he was. A man, though not quite. Radiant, but not blinding. His face was calm, not stern. He spoke no words, yet Elias heard him clearly. "You are not broken," the presence said. "You are waiting." And Elias, in the dream, began to weep, not out of fear or sadness, but because for the first time in his life, he understood something no eyes could show him. When he awoke the next morning, he sat for a long time in silence. He did not tell Leo about this one. Not yet. Some things needed time to take root before they were shared. But something in Elias had changed, as if a piece of him had been gently placed back into alignment. And for the first time in decades, Elias didn't just feel awake. He felt seen. The next days moved like gentle tides. Elias returned to the church even earlier than usual, his fingers eager to touch the keys again, not for performance, but for communion. Each time he played now, it wasn't to remember the past or reclaim what had been lost. It was to enter into something sacred, something just beyond words. It was as if the melodies were no longer coming from within him, but flowing through him, as though heaven had begun whispering through the music. Leo, watching this transformation, became quieter. He sensed something he couldn't quite describe. Elias, though still blind, was seeing something. It wasn't just music anymore. It was revelation. There were moments when Elias would pause mid-song, smile softly, and say things like, "That note, it glows," or "There's gold in that chord." Leo would stare, confused yet moved. He began recording Elias's music with a small device, unsure why, only knowing it needed to be preserved. One rainy afternoon, Elias sat on the pew, his fingers resting on his lap, silent. Leo had brought fresh flowers to brighten the altar, but when he returned, he found Elias still seated, unmoving. "I think I need to paint," Elias said suddenly. Leo froze. "Paint?" "Yes," Elias nodded. "I saw it, in my dream. But it wasn't just a dream. It was a place. A real place. I need to try to show it." Leo knelt beside him. "But Elias, how would you even begin? You've never held a brush. You can't." "I know what I saw," Elias interrupted, voice calm. "And I know what I feel. Something's been placed inside me. It's not mine. I'm just a vessel." Leo didn't argue. There was something in Elias's voice that cut through doubt like a blade through fog. The next morning, Leo brought paints, brushes, and a large canvas. He set it all up on a makeshift easel near the stained glass window where the softest light fell. Elias approached the canvas like a priest approaching the altar. He didn't fumble or hesitate. With Leo's guidance, hand to hand, color to color, Elias began. His fingers remembered what his eyes had long forgotten. Each stroke, each blend, each motion came from a place deeper than vision. Leo guided his hand to where blue met gold, where light needed to dance over shadow. The first painting was clumsy by technical standards, yet hauntingly beautiful. It held something, some essence, that made Leo's eyes well up with tears the moment he saw it. It's like the place you described, Leo whispered. It is the place, Elias replied, but it's not complete. I need to do more. And so they began a new routine. Mornings were for music, afternoons for painting, nights for dreams. The second painting came quicker, then a third. Each one felt more alive than the last. They weren't just images, they were encounters. Those who saw them later would swear they felt something stir in their chest, as if some old longing had been awakened, something from before time. Word of Elias's work began to spread quietly. A passerby, having seen one canvas resting near the door, had asked to buy it. Elias refused. "It's not mine to sell," he said gently. "It was given." As more people heard of the blind man who painted visions of heaven, strangers began arriving, slowly, respectfully. Some left offerings. Others just stood silently before the canvases, tears streaming down their cheeks. Elias remained unchanged, still quiet, still rooted. But within him, a wellspring was rising. Not pride, not ambition, gratitude. He often whispered to himself after the visitors left. "Thank you for letting me see." The little church that once echoed only the sound of Elias's piano now hummed with a different kind of music. One made of hushed footsteps, whispered prayers, and stifled sobs. People came from nearby towns, drawn not by advertisement or spectacle, but by something unseen. The word had spread quietly. A blind man was painting heaven, and those who looked upon his work left changed. It started with a grieving widow. She stood before Elias's second painting, a soft, glowing vision of an open field beneath a sky that shimmered with gold, and wept. "It's where I saw my husband in a dream," she said, placing her hand gently on the edge of the canvas. She didn't ask why or how. She simply believed. And belief, in the sacred space, grew like wildflowers in spring. Leo, who had once only come to clean the church and help Elias with the piano, now found himself protecting silence, organizing the visitors so Elias could work without interruption. He saw it, day after day, how people left lighter, freer, sometimes even healed. One afternoon, a child with a twisted leg limped toward a painting that Elias had finished the day before, a scene of what looked like cascading light falling onto a garden. The boy sat down, stared for nearly an hour, and then stood straighter. Not healed entirely, but something had changed. He walked away, and his mother sobbed in gratitude. "Elias," Leo said one evening as they sat by candlelight, "do you know what you're doing to these people?" "I'm not doing anything," Elias answered quietly, turning his face toward the flickering flame. "I'm just following the light he gave me." There was no pride in his voice, no sense of accomplishment. Elias didn't see the crowds, the reverence, the awe. He only felt the presence that had begun guiding his hands in that dream, the same presence that still visited him in the quiet of night. And yet, something inside him stirred. With every painting, he felt like he was getting closer to something, as though each canvas peeled back a layer, and beneath it, more of heaven was waiting to be revealed. Then one night, the dreams changed. They became clearer, vivid. He no longer saw only glimpses of light or places soaked in gold. He began to see a figure, tall, radiant, cloaked in a white robe that shimmered like moonlight on water. The figure would stand at the edge of a meadow, arms open, waiting. Elias would try to approach, but always wake up before he reached him. Leo noticed the difference. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "I'm being invited," Elias replied, his voice trembling. "He's calling me closer." And so he painted that figure, over and over again, first as a blur, then as a silhouette, and slowly, with trembling fingers, with hints of a face not fully realized, but unmistakably divine. Each attempt came with tears, as if the act of remembering was painful, beautiful, and overwhelming all at once. People stood before these new paintings in awe. Some fell to their knees. One man, who hadn't prayed in 20 years, whispered a single word, "Jesus." Elias heard it. He said nothing, but inside his chest, his heart stirred like a bell rung by wind. The nights began to feel different. Elias could sense it before sleep even claimed him. It was as if the very air around his bed thickened with something holy, like a warm veil descending upon his face, wrapping him in stillness. The darkness no longer felt heavy or confining. It was no longer a barrier. It had become a passage. And every time he drifted into sleep, the dreams returned. But they were not dreams in the usual sense. They were more vivid than memory, more tangible than his waking world. In these dreams, Elias would feel the grass beneath his feet, the wind pressing gently against his cheeks, and the fragrance of something impossibly pure. Each night, the figure at the meadow's edge stood clearer, closer. The man in white, the one Elias now dared to call by name, Jesus. He never spoke. He only stood, waiting, but his silence was filled with meaning. It echoed through the meadows, stirring the leaves, bending the tall grass, and brushing Elias's heart with both comfort and urgency. In one dream, Elias tried to run to him, crying out, "What do you want me to do?" But before he could reach him, the sky would break open with light, and Elias would wake up gasping, his face wet with tears. He began painting before dawn, often before the candles were lit. His fingers trembled with purpose. He didn't know how to explain it to Leo or anyone else. Each stroke came not from sight, but from memory, no, from obedience. The hands that once shook from uncertainty now moved as if guided by invisible threads. His blindness no longer hindered him. In fact, it felt as though the absence of sight had cleared the way for something purer to flow through him. And the paintings changed. They grew larger, more detailed. No longer simple landscapes of golden fields, but vast realms filled with light cascading from open skies, thrones wrapped in clouds, rivers that shimmered like liquid glass, and trees whose leaves sang in silence. People came from farther away now. Some waited in line for hours. They didn't come just to see the paintings. They came to feel something they couldn't name. They came to encounter heaven. One woman traveled for 2 days to reach the church. She had lost her son in a car accident and carried his photo in her hand. When she stood before Elias's most recent canvas, a depiction of a child running through a glowing orchard, she fell to her knees and sobbed. "That's him," she whispered. "That's how he looked the day he left me." "How could you know?" Elias heard her, and his voice cracked when he responded, "I didn't, but he does." That night, Elias knelt alone in the sanctuary, the faint smell of oil paint lingering in the air. The dream had returned again, but this time, Jesus had lifted his hand, not beckoning, blessing, and Elias felt something he hadn't before, a longing not just to see, but to understand. "Why me?" he whispered into the quiet, the candlelight flickering behind his closed eyes. "I'm no prophet. I'm just a man who used to be angry, a man who lost his sight and thought he'd lost everything." But deep within, he heard something, not a voice, but stirring like the rustle of leaves, like the murmur of a river in stillness. "You were blind so others could see." He fell forward, weeping, not from sorrow, but from revelation. For the first time, Elias understood the loss, the pain, the years of bitterness. None of it had been wasted. It had all led to the sacred intersection, where his weakness became a vessel for divine vision. And that's when he began the next painting. He didn't know what it would be. He only felt the weight in his chest, the urgency in his hands. As Leo watched from the doorway, Elias dipped his brush into the deep blues and radiant whites and began to paint something he'd never dared before, heaven itself. Not just light or beauty, but the home he'd always yearned for. The little church no longer echoed with emptiness. Instead, it buzzed softly with hushed voices, the shuffling of hesitant feet and the murmurs of awe. Word had spread far beyond the town. Elias, the blind painter who captured heaven with his fingertips, had become something of a mystery. Some came with skepticism, others with wounds too deep to speak aloud. But all left changed. On a gray morning wrapped in mist, a boy no older than 10 stood silently before one of Elias's paintings, a radiant archway of light stretching over a river that shimmered like glass. His mother knelt beside him, clutching his frail hand. The boy had been diagnosed with leukemia, and his energy was fading fast. But as he gazed up at the painting, a strange stillness fell over him. "Mom," he whispered, "I know what that place feels like." She choked on her tears. "What do you mean?" His lips trembled. "It feels like love." Elias, sitting in the back corner of the sanctuary, wiped a tear from his blind eyes. He hadn't painted that river from imagination. It had come to him in a dream, the same one he returned to night after night. And he knew, somehow, that the boy wasn't just imagining the feeling. He was touching something real, something divine. Each day, new stories emerged. A grieving widow said she felt her late husband's embrace when she stood before a canvas that glowed with golden forests. A war veteran, tormented by memories, claimed the silence in the church soothed his nightmares. One elderly man, long estranged from his daughter, stared at a painting of two hands reaching toward each other and left the church that day to make a phone call he had avoided for 15 years. The art was no longer just expression. It had become encounter. Leo watched all this unfold from behind the candle rack, his young eyes wide with reverence. He had come to trust Elias not just as a painter, but as a prophet of light. One evening, he approached quietly. "How do you know what to paint next?" he asked. "You can't even see the colors." Elias smiled gently, running a hand over the worn wood of his easel. "Because I don't paint with sight," he said. "I paint with memory and obedience." That night, the dream returned, but it was different. Elias found himself standing not on grass, but upon a vast sea of glass, stretching endlessly in all directions. Towers of light rose from the horizon, and in the center stood the man in white. But this time Jesus spoke. His voice was gentle thunder, soft enough to soothe, strong enough to split the soul. "You have shown them my light," he said, "but now you must show them what lies beyond." Elias awoke with a gasp, his hands trembling. He didn't know what beyond meant. He only knew that something was changing, something deep, like a tide turning beneath the surface of his spirit. He began preparing the largest canvas yet. Leo helped him position it near the altar, where sunlight fell directly through the fractured stained glass window. Elias ran his fingers along the blank surface, heart pounding. The dream had shown him colors no language could describe, colors that seemed to sing, to breathe, to carry messages. He dipped his brush. He began to paint, and as he worked, a light flickered faintly through the window, brighter than the sun, softer than candlelight. A woman watching from the back whispered, "There's something holy happening here." She was not wrong. The canvas stood tall and silent, like a gate between two worlds. Elias sat before it, his face turned upward toward the morning sun that filtered through the fractured stained glass window. Though his eyes saw nothing, his soul beheld more than most. His hands hovered in the air, trembling not from fear, but reverence. He had painted many visions before, glimpses of light, echoes of peace. But this was different. This time, he felt like a vessel, not an artist. Leo prepared the brushes, laying each one beside bowls of carefully mixed colors. Elias had taught him how to blend hues by instinct, by the feel of their texture and scent, by the way they clung to the bristles. But today, Elias would not guide Leo. He sat in prayerful silence, waiting for the light to speak. And it did, not in thunder or wind, but in a stillness that filled the church like a holy breath. Elias's hand reached forward. With the first stroke, he felt heat travel through his fingers, as if the canvas had become alive, as if heaven itself had leaned closer to earth to watch. The image that emerged over the next few days wasn't formed by technique, but by something divine. What appeared was not a place, but a passage. Waves of light cascading through a tunnel that bent time. At the center, a figure of brilliant white, arms open, not beckoning, but welcoming. The colors sang. They seemed to move. Some visitors swore they saw the figure blink, or that the light pulsed with a heartbeat. People came from farther than before, some driven by curiosity, others by desperation. A woman who hadn't spoken in years found herself humming softly before the painting. A former addict felt his knees and whispered, "I remember now who I was before the darkness." Even skeptics stood in silence, as if something ancient stirred inside them. The priest of the church, Father Benoit, watched with awe and a hint of fear. "This," he whispered to Leo one evening, "is not just art. It's a window." And yet, Elias felt a weight growing in his spirit. Each day, after the crowds left, he sat alone before the painting. He reached out, fingers brushing the figure in white. "Why me?" he asked aloud. "Why would you choose someone like me?" That night, Elias dreamed again. This time he was not on a sea of glass, but standing beneath a tree with golden leaves, their glow illuminating the air. Jesus stood before him, not distant but close. His hands bore scars, yet they glowed like starlight. "I did not choose you because you were strong," Jesus said, voice warm as sunrise. "I chose you because you were willing." Elias wept in the dream, and when he awoke, tears still streaked his face. He didn't wipe them away. He let them fall, an offering of humility. That morning, he added something new to the painting, a single tear resting at the feet of the radiant figure. Small, almost invisible, but those who noticed said it was the most powerful part of all, because it reminded them that even in heaven, someone understands what it means to cry. Elias no longer needed to ask if the painting was complete. He knew it wasn't, not because the image was unfinished, but because the purpose behind it was still unfolding. The church, once echoing only with forgotten hymns and dust, now pulsed with silent prayers and trembling hope. Every day, footsteps echoed down its long, cracked floors, some hesitant, some hurried, some carried by desperation. What was once an old chapel tucked into the heart of a fading town had become a lighthouse. People arrived not to view a painting, but to feel it. They stood in front of Elias's work for minutes, sometimes hours, with hands pressed to their hearts or tear-streaked cheeks. Some collapsed to their knees without understanding why. Others left notes at the base of the canvas, scribbled confessions, pleas for forgiveness, letters to loved ones long gone. No one instructed them to. It was as if the painting itself called out something in them, something sacred and asleep. Yet Elias remained quiet, almost hidden in the background. He sat beneath the arched window beside the altar, listening to the way people breathed when they entered. He memorized their steps, the rhythms of their sorrow. Every now and then, someone would recognize him as the artist, but he never claimed the credit. "This was never mine," he'd say, his fingers brushing across his chest where his heart beat slow and steady. "I was just listening." One afternoon, as the sun poured gold over the floorboards, a boy of 10 entered the church with his mother. He was blind. Elias heard the boy's cane tap gently across the floor, but it was his voice that struck him. "Mom," the boy whispered, "there's someone singing here." His mother paused, tears already in her eyes. "There's no music, sweetheart." But Elias knew what the boy had heard. It was the same sound he had once heard in his dreams, a vibration between silence and light, a sound too sacred to explain. Elias walked toward the boy slowly, his cane sweeping in front of him. He crouched low. "You heard him," he said gently. "Didn't you?" The boy nodded, his face beaming. "Yes, he sings like the sky does at night." Elias reached out and gently touched the boy's hand. "Then you already see more than most." That night, Elias returned to his canvas, but instead of adding new strokes, he placed his hands upon it and prayed. He prayed not for himself, but for every soul who had passed through that door. He asked that the wounds they carried would not follow them home, that they would remember who they were beneath the weight of the world. Then, something extraordinary happened. A soft wind blew through the sealed windows, rustling the old banners and extinguishing several candles in a quiet hush. The church dimmed, yet the painting glowed brighter. The figure at the center, Jesus, seemed to step forward, not physically but spiritually, as if the veil between heaven and earth had thinned just enough to let him breathe through the colors. Elias felt it deep within him, a calling not to paint, not to teach, but to surrender. His life, his pain, his blindness, none of it had been a punishment. It had been a path. Every tear had watered the roots of this purpose. And now, The fruit of it was blooming across every heart that stood before his work. He knelt and whispered, "Thank you for choosing me to feel the things no one sees." The days blurred into one another, not because they lacked meaning, but because each one was saturated with a holiness that could not be measured by hours. Elias no longer counted the time by sunrise or sunset, but by the people who entered the church and left changed. Something had shifted, both within the sanctuary and within him. He was no longer just a man who had once been blind. He was now the steward of a divine flame, and that flame was beginning to spread, word of the painting, and more so, of the presence it seemed to carry, travel beyond the borders of the quiet town. Pilgrims, skeptics, artists, and broken souls began to make their way to the little church where a blind man had painted what no eyes had seen. Some came with hope, some came with mockery, but most left with silence and awe in their bones. Elias remained humble in the face of it all. He never stood on a pulpit, never gave grand speeches. His only sermons were the stillness he kept in prayer, and the whispers of Scripture he traced from memory. He would sit on the stone steps with those who wept and let them speak until they found peace. He would pray with trembling hands over the shoulders of those who had lost everything, and he would always say the same thing in the end. He knows you. Even if you've forgotten yourself, he hasn't. One evening, as twilight folded gently over the church, a woman arrived holding a bundle of cloth. She said nothing, only knelt before the painting and wept silently. Elias approached slowly, his footsteps practiced in reverence. "What is it you carry?" he asked softly. She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a child's shoes, small, worn, and still holding the weight of memory. "He died last winter," she whispered, voice trembling. "I haven't been able to let go." Elias reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the shoes. "Then don't let go," he said. "Let him carry the weight with you." The woman looked at him, confused. "But how?" Elias turned his face slightly toward the painting, though his eyes saw nothing. "You just ask." He never turns away the broken. That night, after the church emptied, Elias had a vision. It wasn't like before. This time, he wasn't in the clouds or surrounded by music. He was standing in the very church itself. Only it was radiant. Light poured from the walls, and every person who had ever stepped through the doors was standing inside, whole and healed. At the center, Jesus stood, not as a distant figure, but as a friend. He looked at Elias and said, "Keep the doors open." Elias woke in tears. He understood now. This wasn't about a single painting or even about the miracles people spoke of. It was about preparing hearts for something greater. His blindness had not disqualified him. It had refined him. The next morning, Elias asked a local woodworker to carve a phrase above the entrance to the church. In gold letters, it read, "Come to me, all who are weary." And below it, in Elias's own hand, a small sign was nailed to the frame. "He waits for you inside." The days following Elias's vision were unlike any he had lived before, though the world around him remained the same. The creaking pews, the rustling leaves outside the stained glass windows, the scent of wax and incense lingering in the air. Something inside him had awakened. It was as if his soul had been stretched open, and now the breath of heaven itself moved through him with every beat of his heart. He had always prayed, always listened, always believed. But now, there was a stillness deeper than silence, and a presence closer than breath. He could feel it when he pressed his hand against the cool stone of the church walls. He could sense it in the way the air trembled before dawn. And at night, when the last candle flickered and all voices were gone, Elias would sit before his painting and wait. It was during one such night, when the stars outside seemed to whisper and the earth held its breath, that it happened again. Elias sat on the floor, legs crossed, palms open on his lap. He whispered words he no longer remembered learning. "Speak, Lord, I am listening." And the room changed. There was no wind, no earthquake, no fire, only a warmth that came from nowhere and everywhere. And then a light, not blinding but enveloping. He felt it before he saw it. And when it came, it didn't shine like sunlight or candle flame. It shimmered like the memory of a promise kept. He wasn't dreaming. He was awake. But suddenly, he was not in the church anymore. He stood on a hill of purest white, beneath a sky that pulsed with color and sound, and something he could only call music. The ground beneath him was soft like velvet and solid like truth. Rivers flowed with light, not water. Trees sparkled with fruit that seemed to sing. And in the distance, there was a city rise like a crown of glory. Elias trembled. He could see. His eyes, long dead to the world, were now alive in this place. He turned slowly, and everything he saw filled his chest with awe so overwhelming it brought him to his knees. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered the only words he could manage. "This is heaven." And then he heard a voice, familiar, strong, gentle, a voice that had spoken in dreams and in silence, and now stood beside him, clothed in brilliance. "I showed you darkness," said Jesus, "so you would recognize my light." Elias looked up and saw him, not as the painting, not as the whisper, but as the living presence of grace itself. Jesus knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've carried pain, you've carried doubt, and yet you waited. You listened. Now I give you sight, not just for yourself, but for those who have none." And then Elias woke, back in the church. But something had changed. Though his physical blindness remained, his soul had been given new eyes. The visions had not ended. They had only begun. That morning, he picked up a new canvas, not to paint what he remembered, but to paint what he had seen. The church that once echoed with silence now pulsed with a quiet expectancy. The walls, once dim and worn by time, now seemed to glow subtly with each sunrise, as if they too bore witness of the shift that had taken place within. Elias, though still blind in the world's eyes, moved through the sanctuary with the confidence of a man who had seen something too glorious for this earth to hold. He had not spoken much since the vision, not because he was afraid, but because words felt too small, too fragile to carry the weight of what he had experienced. So instead, he let the paint speak. With every stroke of his brush, every blend of color, every silent hour before the canvas, Elias told a story not with words, but with heaven's memory. His paintings had changed. Where once they had been abstract glimpses of light, they now took on form and purpose. There were golden fields with no sun, trees that shimmered like they held songs in their leaves, skies painted with hues not found in any palette on earth. And always, somewhere within the painting, sometimes bold, sometimes hidden, was a figure robed in white, his arms open, his gaze filled with a love that broke people's defenses without a single word. Visitors began to come. At first, it was the curious, people who had heard of a blind man painting heaven. Then came the skeptics, the art critics, the faithful and the faithless alike. And one by one, as they stood before Elias's work, something strange happened. They wept, not from sadness, but from recognition. As if something inside them, some long-lost memory or echo of truth, had been stirred awake. As if the paintings didn't just show heaven, but reminded them that it was real. Elias never asked for fame. He never spoke during exhibitions. But when someone would approach him, broken-hearted, questioning, trembling from the weight of their own life, he would gently place a hand over theirs and whisper, "He showed me, and he's waiting for you too." And those words, simple, soft, barely louder than a prayer, became like seeds. He planted them not just in conversation, but in color, in canvas, in stillness. One night, as the church lay still and Elias worked by the faint glow of a single candle, he paused. His brush hung in the air, unmoving. Something was different, not wrong, just shifted. He turned his head slightly and whispered, "You're here again, aren't you?" The silence deepened, and in that silence, a warmth began to fill the room. Not the warmth of fire, but the warmth of presence. A peace so deep, it made him tremble. "You've been faithful with little," came the voice he knew by heart. "Now I will entrust you with much." And Elias, humbled to his knees, wept not for sorrow, but for joy too great to hold in his body. He understood now. The paintings were never about him. They were a bridge for others to find the one who found him. The whispers of Elias's paintings had become rivers, rivers that reached places even he could not imagine. While he remained in the modest church, quietly painting with the guidance of a presence he could no longer deny. The world began to speak his name. But more than his name, it spoke of the message his work carried. There was a boy, 8 years old, who hadn't spoken since his father passed away. His mother brought him into the church one gray morning, not expecting a miracle, but hoping for a breath of peace. The boy walked slowly, his small hand clutching her fingers tightly, eyes wide and empty. When he stood before a painting Elias had titled "The Garden of Rest," he froze. In the image, golden trees swayed over a tranquil path, and at the end of the path stood a figure in white, arms open. It was simple, but it spoke louder than any sermon. The boy pulled away from his mother's hand and stepped closer. After several long minutes, his lips parted. "Daddy is safe." His mother fell to her knees, sobbing not because of grief, but because the boy had found words again, and those words brought hope, not fear. News of such moments spread, not as sensational stories, but as quiet testimonies passed from one broken heart to another. People didn't come to the church to be impressed. They came to remember that something beyond this world still reached for them. One evening, as rain beat against the stained glass windows and Elias sat painting in silence, a man entered the sanctuary. His steps were heavy, not with weariness, but with the burden of guilt. He had lived a life running from everything sacred, burning bridges, hurting those who loved him, building walls so high even he could no longer climb out. He sat in the back, said nothing, watched nothing, just wept into his hands. But something pulled him forward, slowly, like a moth drawn to light. He found himself before Elias's newest painting, "The Hand That Waits." In it, Jesus stood at a door, his hand reaching out but not knocking, just waiting. The man dropped to his knees and whispered the first prayer he had spoken in decades. "Forgive me. I miss you." In that moment, Elias, blind, quiet, steady, rose from his chair and walked to the man. Without hesitation, he placed his hand on the stranger's shoulder. "He never left you," Elias said. "He was just waiting for you to remember." These were the seeds Elias now sowed into broken souls, into trembling hands, into silence thick with longing. Even the most skeptical began to admit that his paintings didn't just capture beauty. They unlocked something deeper, a knowing, a pull, a voice. And then came the girl, 17, pale, fragile. Her arms bore marks of battles fought in secret. She came alone, sat for hours in front of a painting Elias called "The Embrace of Mercy." When she finally stood, she walked up to Elias and placed a small note in his hand. He could not read it, but he held it like it was sacred. Later, someone read it aloud to him. It simply said, "I was going to die tonight, but I saw his eyes in your painting, and I think I want to live." The silence in the church was like a living thing, breathing, watching, listening. And Elias, now older, more fragile in body but stronger in spirit, felt that silence deep in his chest. Every brushstroke he made was no longer about art. It was obedience, worship, communion. One night, as the wind howled like ancient spirits outside and the candles flickered with trembling flames, Elias sat in front of a blank canvas. It had been days since he'd painted, not because he was uninspired, but because he sensed something was coming, something holy. He whispered a simple prayer. "If you have more to show me, I am ready." Then it happened. The room didn't fill with light. It dissolved into it. Walls became like mist. The air turned gold. Elias sat frozen, not in fear, but in reverence. He could not see with his eyes, but he felt every detail of what unfolded. He was no longer in the church. He stood, whole, unburdened, unblind, in a place beyond words. The ground beneath his feet shimmered like crystal, but felt softer than any earthly soil. The sky above was not blue. It was light itself, and before him, in robes that seemed woven from glory, stood Jesus. This time, Elias did not see him in visions. He saw him fully, clearly, and Jesus smiled. "You have painted what you could not see," he said, "and in doing so, you have opened eyes that were closed." Elias fell to his knees. His soul trembled with joy that didn't need a reason. "Why me?" he asked, tears running from eyes that in this place could finally cry light instead of sorrow. Jesus knelt beside him. Because you trusted when you had no proof. You followed my voice in the dark, and now I will let you see what others cannot. Then Jesus lifted Elias gently and led him to a cliff that overlooked a vast valley. In it, Elias saw every soul he had touched. Children smiling, men kneeling, women singing, each surrounded by the light from his paintings. It wasn't art. It was memory. It was ministry. Your blindness was never a curse, Jesus whispered. It was a canvas. Elias wept, not from grief, but from the overwhelming goodness of God. When he awoke, he was back in the church. The vision had passed, but the transformation remained. That day he painted again, not from memory or imagination, but from what he saw in that sacred place. His final painting, placed above the altar, was unlike anything before. It showed a narrow path lined with golden leaves, a figure in white walking ahead, always ahead, but with one hand reaching back, waiting. Underneath, in tiny letters, Elias asked someone to write, "I once was blind, but now I truly see." The first morning after Elias completed his final painting, the church was unusually still. Sunlight pierced through the cracks of broken stained glass windows, casting ribbons of gold across the wooden floor. The soft rustle of leaves outside played like a lullaby of heaven, and a gentle breeze flowed to the open door, as if the air itself were kneeling in reverence. Elias sat quietly in his usual corner, his hands folded in peace, his body still, his spirit profoundly serene. He had not spoken since finishing the painting. He didn't need to. What was there to say after witnessing eternity? One by one, people came. It started with a few locals, those who had known Elias when he was just a blind man, sitting quietly, whispering prayers into the stone walls. But soon, word spread far beyond the village. Travelers, believers, skeptics, artists, even those who had lost faith, each came to see the canvas. They didn't come for technique. They came for truth. And when they stood before the painting, something unexplainable happened. Many began to weep, softly, quietly, as if their soul had remembered something the world had made them forget. Some dropped to their knees. Others simply stood in silence, hand over heart, as if the image awakened something ancient inside them. A mother who had buried a child felt a peace she hadn't known in years. A former pastor who had lost his way stood trembling, whispering, "He never left me." A child with a speech disorder turned to his mother and said, "For the first time, it's beautiful." And through it all, Elias sat with his hands on his lap, smiling, not seeing with his eyes, but seeing with something far deeper. The eyes of the spirit refined by fire, softened by grace, and now crowned with eternal vision. One late afternoon, as golden light flooded the chapel and soft music drifted from a violin, someone played in the corner. A woman approached Elias. She had traveled for days after reading about the painting. Her heart was shattered. Her hope was gone. When she stood before Elias, she didn't speak right away. Her lips trembled. Her fingers clutched the chain around her neck, a cross that had long felt like an empty symbol. "I don't know what I believe anymore," she finally said. Elias tilted his head slightly, listening. "I feel so far from God. Too far." He reached out, gently taking her hands into his own. "Then stay still," he said softly. "Let him come close." Her tears fell freely. For the first time in years, she prayed. And not long after that, others followed. Dozens, then hundreds. They came to the chapel not because it was grand, but because it had become holy, a place where heaven had touched earth with the faith of a blind man who had dared to see. But Elias knew his time was drawing near. Late one evening, as the last candle flickered, Elias rested his head back against the stone wall behind him. He smiled, not because he was leaving, but because he was finally going home. And in his last breath, he whispered a name, Jesus. The next morning, they found him with a serene smile on his face, the painting glowing ever so faintly as sunlight passed over it. There was no sadness, only awe, only joy. In the days that followed, the town placed a plaque beside the painting. It read, "He was blind, but he saw more than most. He heard the voice of heaven and painted what faith revealed." His life was a window into glory. But even more powerful than the plaque was a quiet shift that happened in the hearts of those who came. Faith returned, hope bloomed, and lives changed, because one man chose to believe in the voice that called him in the dark, because Elias had followed without seeing, trusted without proof, and loved without fear. And so, his story did not end. It continued. In every brushstroke of healing, in every whispered prayer, in every tear wiped away in the presence of Jesus,